Hello and welcome to Rewind Reviews. In this video we're going to be taking a look at a movie that is long overdue coming, and that movie is The Flash. Released in 2023, the big screen adaptation of the DC comic books sees Barry Allen using his super speed to change the past, but his attempt to save his family creates a world without superheroes, forcing him to race for his life in order to save the future. The Flash is directed by Andy Muschietti, written by Christina Hodson, John Francis Daley, Jonathan Goldstein and Joby Harold, and stars Ezra Miller, Michael Keaton, Sasha Calle, Michael Shannon, Ron Livingston, Mirabel Verdú, Kiersey Clemens, Ben Affleck and Jeremy Irons. Well, to say this movie is long overdue is a bit of an understatement. This film has been stuck in development hell for years. It has been such a long road trying to get The Flash up and running onto the big screen. We've had writers and directors leaving the movie left, right and centre over the usual creative differences. We've had pandemics, we've had the changing of the guards with regards to DC, and of course we've also had a few incidences involving a certain actor. So now, having actually seen this movie, I was quite surprised seeing how well it did turn out. I didn't really know how to feel about this movie prior to seeing it, especially with the reactions online, with some people absolutely hating it while others absolutely love it. In fact, prior to this movie getting released, the general consensus from a lot of critics who had seen this movie was that this was one of the best movies that DC had ever made, and that is a really high bar. I mean, admittedly it was an earlier cut of the movie that they did see, so I don't know how different this version is compared to that one, but that was most of the reactions that we were seeing from a lot of people that had seen this movie. I am a fan of The Flash. He is definitely one of my favourite DC Comics characters, and I really was curious to see what it was that they were going to do with this movie, especially since what story it was that they were going to be adapting for this movie. So I suppose the real question is this movie good or is this movie bad? And in my opinion, I do think this movie's pretty good, but it does have some problems. But just before I go any further into this video, I do need to make sure that you are aware this is going to be a spoiler-free video, so I'm not going to be going any spoilery details whatsoever in this video. I am planning on doing a spoiler talk video for this movie, and that's probably going to be out within the next week or so. So on with this review. So what is the story? Well, The Flash is a movie that takes a loose inspiration from the Flashpoint comic book mini-series, which sees Barry Allen, aka The Flash, travelling back to the past to save his mother before she is killed. And in doing so, Barry creates a brand new timeline which is completely different from what he knows, where some characters and friends that he knows no longer exist or are vastly different. And that is pretty much what this movie does do, and in some ways it can be fairly faithful to that original story, but with some pretty big changes in order to fit within the already established DCEU. One of the biggest changes in this movie being General Zod from 2013's Man of Steel being the big world-ending threat in this story, as opposed to the war between Themyscira and Atlantis. The changes do mostly fit and suit the story, but there are definitely a few things that I would have liked to have seen, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. And there are some story decisions that for me didn't work, but that's only really towards the end. The majority of it I did genuinely think was good, and I think that the build-up really works. This is a very character-driven movie, with Barry Allen's character arc being the prime focus of this story, and I really do like that decision. It makes this movie feel a lot more personal, and it allows you to connect with the character a lot more in a way that you probably wouldn't have if it just completely focuses on the bigger world-ending stuff. And it also adds to a lot of the more emotional sequences as well, with the emotional payoff actually being quite satisfying because of what it is that they do with the characters. And I will admit I did shed a tear or two. So let's talk a little bit about the characters. Leading this movie is Ezra Miller playing Barry Allen, aka The Flash. Now, I think I'm in the majority here when I say that I don't think that they were a great choice for the role. The performance in Justice League, while okay overall, just didn't fit the character, and the awkward jokes just didn't work for me. But despite that, and how I feel about Ezra Miller in real life, I will admit that I do think that there is an improvement in the performance in this one. Barry is much better this time around, and his story involving his mum and dad is the emotional anchor of this movie. A large part of the reason for the improvement is what they do with him, because during this movie Barry finds himself trapped in 2013 and he needs to work with his younger self in order to fix things. It's actually a really clever idea putting the two Barrys together, because it forces Barry Prime, the one that we are introduced to from the beginning of the movie, the more experienced one, to kind of look at himself in a new light. It forces Barry to confront a part of himself that needs to be improved, and over the course of the movie we get to see a much more mature and wiser Barry start to form, and it really works. I really did like this idea, and how Ezra does play both of these roles I do think is pretty good. You know, despite his younger self being very annoying, which is kind of done on purpose, and I do appreciate what it was that they were trying to do with him. I do think that some of the jokes that they have with younger Barry do work work, but I do think that sometimes they do push it just a little bit too far. Now, I'd imagine that most people who wanted to see this movie in the first place wanted to see it for one very specific reason, and that reason is Michael Keaton as Batman. Batman returns, and it is a joy to see. He really slips back into this role with ease. He is clearly having an absolute blast, and that is definitely infectious. He's easily the best part of this movie, and I really did enjoy what it is that they do with him. He's a lot more physical than before, and a lot faster too, which really did take me by surprise, but it's really awesome to see, and his fight scenes are just amazing. And I like that they managed to maintain a lot of elements from his older appearances as well, such as the costume, the gadgets, attitude, and of course the dialogue. I know a lot of those lines that were featured in the trailer are definitely there more for fan service and nostalgia, and there are maybe one or two lines that I do think maybe do kind of go a little bit too far into that, but honestly, I didn't really mind it, and I feel like how it is that they are used within the movie do fit the narrative and the tone. None of that stuff really feels out of place, and I don't feel like it's gratuitous at all. Like, prime example, I thought that there was going to be like a big sequence involving the Batmobile, and they don't actually do that. It's on screen, they do have the Batmobile there, but they don't actually use it. It would have been really easy for them to have just leaned into the more nostalgia films elements of this movie, but they don't do that, and I do like that decision. The only real negative I can think of with him is some of his choices throughout the film. I don't feel like anything he does in this movie is too out of character, and I know that is definitely going to be debatable for a lot of people, but I do feel like some of the decisions that he makes throughout this movie are really quick and a bit too rushed, and I kind of feel like they kind of jumped over a few things as well just to kind of get him in the suit as quickly as possible. But outside of that, I really loved seeing him back on screen, and majority of the stuff that they did with him I did like. But he isn't the only Batman who makes an appearance in this movie. The start of this movie does take place within the Snyderverse, so we get to see for one last time Ben Affleck as Batman. It's only a small role, and it is sad that this is most likely the last time that we are going to see Ben Affleck actually suiting up as Batman. But it is great to see him again, and I do think his action sequence is pretty fun. I've got to be honest, it did kind of feel like something that you'd see in like the animated series or even just the comic books in general. This does feel like a lot more of a comic booky version of Batman that we don't really see a lot of on the big screen. As much as I loved the Batman, I mean, I've got a poster of it on my wall. I really did love that movie, and I loved the tone that they had gone for with that movie, but I would like to see a more comic booky Batman in the future on the big screen. And with the Brave and the Bold on the way, I am really looking forward to seeing what it is that they do with Batman in the future. Andy Muschietti, the director of this movie, is going to be directing that movie. At the time of making this video, he is attached to direct that movie, so I am really looking forward to seeing what it is that he does with that film. But that being said, that was one of the biggest questions that I did have with regards to this movie, because as I said, this is an adaptation of the Flashpoint story, and one of the biggest parts of that story is the Batman that is in those comic books. In the Flashpoint comic book, as well as the Flashpoint Paradox movie, which is a brilliant movie, check it out if you've never seen it, the Batman that is introduced in Flashpoint is Thomas Wayne, not Bruce Wayne. It's a really good twist, and I really like what it is that you do with that character. It's really interesting and fascinating to see how this story would play out with a Thomas Wayne, especially with Jeffrey Dean Morgan playing Thomas Wayne in Batman v Superman. A lot of people were speculating that that was the reason why they picked him to play Thomas Wayne, because he would be amazing as Thomas Wayne Batman. So it is disappointing that we never got to see that. I was hoping that maybe he might factor into this in some way, but unfortunately he doesn't, so I am disappointed with regards to that. But we did get Michael Keaton back as Batman, so I'm not really that disappointed. Now, it isn't just returning characters that make appearances in this movie. We do get the introduction of a brand new character. This is a brand new version of this character, and that is Supergirl, played by Sasha Calle. I will admit I was a little bit confused which version of the character she was going to be playing based on the costume and hairstyle. Back when they were filming this movie, there was a lot of set pictures that were getting leaked online, and we did get a first glimpse at what these characters were going to look like, including Supergirl and her new costume. Me and a lot of other fans were convinced that she was going to be playing Laura Lane Kent, but as it turns out, in this movie she is playing the original Supergirl, Kara Zor-El, and I think she does a really good job. She feels different to previous versions of Supergirl, and I like the direction that they do go with her, but I do think her development is overall rushed, and I really think that we could have spent a lot more time with her to make her decisions feel a bit more natural. I really like Sasha Calle as Supergirl. I think she does come across as really likeable. She is beautiful, she's really passionate about the role. I love the video that they released of her actually being off with the role. It was really great, and that was one thing that really sold me on her playing this character. I think she has done a fantastic job in this movie, and I really would like to see more of her in the future. I mean, if that is possible to do. But she is very underused in this movie, and I don't think it helps that they really did push her a lot within the marketing, so it did make her feel like she was going to be a much bigger part of this movie than she actually is. And unfortunately the same can be said for Michael Shannon returning as Zod. He's in this, and that's pretty much it. He's really only part of this movie to act as the big world-ending threat, and they do connect Kara and Zod's story together, and I do like that, but they barely do anything with him. And there is one other character in this movie that does appear, but I can't really say too much about them without going too much into spoilers. I like the idea that they were going full with it, and I do think that the introduction of that character and the way that it's built up over time is pretty good, but I do think that it is rushed, and I do think that there is definitely a lot left to be desired. That being said, having Zod and the Kryptonians coming back in this movie does mean that we do get some pretty amazing action sequences. The action overall in this movie is pretty good. It is like something straight out of the comic books or animated shows. They're really energetic and imaginative, and I love what they do with each of the characters' powers, especially what they do with the Flash. It feels so much more powerful than his last big screen outing, with more abilities and a better depiction of his speed and some genuinely amazing visuals. I really love the idea of including a calorie counter that forces him to keep his energy up, with that playing a big part in an earlier sequence, because it does add some tension to that scene, but that does become a bit of a problem because it never comes up again. They do kind of play it up a little bit throughout the movie, with that kind of becoming a bit of a running joke, with Barry 2 basically becoming really hungry and just eating absolutely everything he can get his hands on. I mean, there is a lot of scenes of him just chewing through all sorts of stuff, and it's kind of gross at times. But that's really it, and I think that it is a lost opportunity to really add some more tension and a lot more stakes to some of the bigger set pieces. I am slightly curious what was actually cut in this movie, because I know prior to this movie getting released, Sasha Calle did actually do a little interview where she did talk a little bit about some of her action sequences, and she did say that there were some more extreme stuff that were included originally but were cut out. And it does feel like maybe there might have been one or two things that were trimmed here and there, but it's nothing to really sort of take you out of the movie, and it isn't jarring or anything. But honestly, overall, the action in this movie is really good, and I do think that it is handled really well. The costumes in this movie are pretty good as well. I like what it is that they have done with some of the more pre-established costumes, like what they've done with Michael Keaton's Batman, which is basically like an updated version of the one that he wore back in Batman Returns. I do still find it quite funny that he still has that neck piece that can't allow him to move his head. It doesn't actually restrict him at all. As I said, like, he is a lot more faster and a lot more agile in this movie. I'm really amazed what it is that they're able to actually do with him. But that is still a thing, and I did wonder if they were going to change that or not and make it a bit more like what Christian Bale had in The Dark Knight. But it is really cool seeing that original costume on screen, albeit just a slightly updated one, and seeing all the other costumes that he does have in basically like this big like wardrobe just full of these different suits. Supergirl's costume, I'll admit, when I saw those set pictures I was a bit 50-50 on it. It was a good translation of that costume from the comic books, but I wasn't really sure how it was going to look on screen. But I do think that actually seeing it in the movie in action is really good, and I do think that it is actually a really good interpretation of that costume. The Ben Affleck Batman costume in this one, like, first of all, I do appreciate them actually going for a blue and grey costume. That's something that I've always wanted to see Batman wearing in a big screen movie. I'm just not really a fan of all the little armour pieces that he's got on. It just looks really weird, and I don't really understand the decision behind it. I'm not a fan of a lot of the decisions that they made with regards to Ben Affleck's Batman, but one thing that I really did like about his version of the character was the costume from the 2016 movie. That is the best Batman costume I've ever seen on screen. Give me a blue and grey version of that costume and I think that will be the best Batman costume that has ever been put to screen. But when it comes to the Flash costume in this movie, it's a bit different from what he had in Justice League. Justice League, he had like a proper armour suit. Looks something quite similar to what he had in the Injustice games, and I actually quite liked how it looked. But I've got to be honest, like when I saw the trailer for this movie, when I started seeing the costume actually in action, action, everything, I was a bit 50-50 on it. I wasn't really sure what to think of it, but it has grown on me a lot over time. And I really do like how it does sort of look like a combination of the more sort of armoured look that he had in Justice League and the more sort of like sleeker, normal costume that he had in like the TV series. His costume is designed to kind of prevent friction, so it makes sense that it would sort of look like a combination of the two, because it needs to handle those higher speeds of velocity, but it also needs to allow him to move without just burning up. So it does make sense, and I do like how it does look overall, even though it does look really tight and really uncomfortable. But it is a really good interpretation of this costume, and I do think that it does look really good overall, and I like that it does kind of address why it is that the lightning looks a little bit different in this movie as well. That was something that I was always kind of unsure of in the Justice League movie, because why is the Flash logo gold in that movie when his lightning is blue? So I like that that is something that they do fix in this movie, with the way that whenever he's in that suit the lightning is yellow, but whenever he's outside of the costume it's blue. So I like that decision. So that means that whenever Barry 2 is using his powers, he doesn't have that costume on, so all of his action sequences are all in blue. So there's a really nice contrast between the two of them. And I do think it is quite funny what it is that they do with his version of the costume, where it's basically just like a modified version of one of the older Batman costumes, where it's all just like sort of like sliced up and spray painted red and yellow. It's nowhere near as good as the other Flash costume, and that is deliberate, but I do appreciate one little thing that they do have in this movie, and that is when Barry does turn his head to look at people and all the mask is all stretched and skewed. I just love that little joke. And that is something that I was actually quite curious to see in this movie, because the Flash is definitely one of the lighter characters within DC Comics, and there is definitely a lot of comedy that is injected into this movie. Andy Muschietti's last movies, It Chapter 1 and It Chapter 2, are both full-on horror movies, absolutely, but I was surprised just how funny those movies were, and that comedy is brought into this movie. There's a few speckles of horror thrown in here as well, but it is a lot more comedic, and I do think that mostly the comedy does work. Not all of it does land, but I do think some of the main jokes, some of the bigger jokes in this movie do land and did make me laugh. Most of them revolve around the Flash using his powers, especially when Barry 2 gains his powers and the stuff that he just gets up to and he just causes absolute havoc just testing his speed out. Plus, if you're like me and you really were a bit confused on the way that Barry actually runs in the Justice League movie, it just looks so awkward with the way that he runs. They do kind of address that in this movie, and there is a joke that does feel like a proper address to that criticism. I think that was probably one of the biggest laughs of the movie. It definitely got my audience laughing, so I did like that addition. There are a lot of other jokes that are injected into this movie, and I do think that a lot of them do work very well within the context of what it is that's going on. They do feel very within character. Barry 2, I think that some of his jokes do work. I like some of the inexperienced stuff that he does have, but I do think that some of that stuff is overplayed a little bit too much. And as I said, that can lean to him feeling a little bit annoying, but I do feel like that is on purpose. So I'm a bit split on that overall. But back to the costumes, when it comes to some of the other characters like Zod, like the Kryptonians, and Supergirl as well, there are definitely a lot of CG enhancements to make the costumes look a little bit better. So when it comes to Zod and the Kryptonians, they do look very accurate to what it was that they did look like in Man of Steel, and they do look okay overall, but the CG is one thing that has drawn a lot of criticism since this movie has been released. The costumes, I feel like, is probably one of the few stronger elements of this movie, but that's kind of it for the CG. Overall, when it comes to the CGI in this movie, it is not good. There's a lot of CG characters that are in this movie that really do not work very well and do look like just computer generated images. They do not look realistic at all, especially early on, because as I said, like the opening action sequence, even though it's really fun, it's really imaginative, and I really enjoyed that sequence, the one thing that really did kind of put me off a little bit was how some of the CG was in that moment, because the opening action sequence for this movie involves the Flash basically having to save a load of babies that are falling out of a building, and neither the babies, a lot of the materials, or even the Flash himself, whenever he does go full CGI, looks good at all. In fact, they do not look right at all. And there are other things that you do see within the Speed Force that doesn't look right. I understand what it is that they are trying to go for in that moment, and Andy Muschietti has said that the visuals were meant to look a little bit weird, and in those sequences I can kind of understand, but Other things that do play a part in that sequence, I don't, and that's the stuff that needed a lot of improvement. I really have to go into a bit more detail when I talk about that in my spoiler talk video. That's going to be one of the biggest things that I want to talk about. But I don't think it's completely awful. I mean, there are some things in this movie that I do think do look alright, like how they do represent the Flash's abilities whenever he does go super speed, the visuals that they do have in those moments, I do think look good. Like, one of my favourite sequences of the movie is a scene involving the Flash basically running from Central City all the way to Gotham. It's one take and it's brilliant. I love what it is that they've done with it, and I really love that sequence and how they've represented his powers. And the visuals that they've gone for with regards to the Speed Force, again, I do think is a really interesting and imaginative idea. It's not something that we've seen before. It looks very different from other time travel based movies, and the ideas do work overall. It is definitely something really interesting. It just needed a bit of work. And the same goes for how they handle the two Barrys in this movie, because both Barrys are played by Ezra Miller. I believe it's deepfake. As far as I'm aware, this is a version of deepfake where they basically just like replicated Ezra Miller's face from one Barry onto the other. And in a lot of the sequences that they've released from the trailers, it actually looks alright. But then there are other sequences where it is very obvious which one is Ezra Miller and which one is the double. And it is definitely a little bit awkward to see, especially when you do have the two of them interacting with each other and you have Ezra Miller there, but then you look over and then the other Flash just looks all sort of a bit weird and just sort of plasticky, and it's really weird to see. I'm briefly plugging my last review at Last Action Hero. I did briefly talk about a sequence involving Arnold Schwarzenegger interacting with another version of himself, an actor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I think that that effect still holds up, and that movie's 30 years old, but compared to how this one is handled, this is 2023, that effect should look so much better. There are TV shows like Friends which absolutely nailed it, but why can't this movie do that? This could have worked really well, and I do think that deepfake technology has come on a long way, scarily so. Just look at the stuff that it did with Luke Skywalker in The Mandalorian. I mean, that is incredible what they've been able to do, but why wasn't that able to be used properly in this movie? I appreciate what it was that they were trying to do, and I like what it is that they are able to do with that, because it does mean that the two characters are able to interact in a way that you wouldn't normally be able to do if you were filming one character first and then having them redo that same scene just as the other character. You just couldn't do it the way that you would normally do. But it is on that uncanny valley, and there are definitely a lot of moments where it is very obvious that it is only one Ezra Miller there and the other person is just a body double. So I definitely think that CG overall does need a lot more work. It doesn't really look finished at times, and I really think that is a big disappointment. As I said, I understand that there was a lot of delays for this movie, so there is definitely a big chance that they didn't really get the chance to really sort of work on this movie as much as they would have liked to, especially with how all the stuff with Warner Brothers and Discovery was sort of playing out, to the point where it was kind of up in the air on what was actually going to happen with this movie, whether they were just going to like dump it on HBO Max or whether they were going to try and give it a big screen release or just scrap it altogether. But considering just how much money they had actually put in this movie, it was never not going to be released, but it was up in the air about what direction they were going to go with releasing it. Unlike the Batgirl movie, I've got to be honest, I was really looking forward to that. I really love Batgirl, and I was really interested in seeing what it was that they were going to do with that movie, especially since Michael Keaton was going to be a part of it and Brendan Fraser playing Firefly. It sounded really interesting, so I'm really disappointed that we are never going to get to see that film, but at least we're still getting Blue Beetle. So anyway, back to this movie. As I said, when it comes to the effects, there's definitely a lot of improvement that could have been made. They really do not look good at all. I do think that there are some really imaginative things that they do. There are some really creative visuals that they do make because of it, but some of them don't look finished, and I really think that they could have been improved a lot more. And when it comes to the soundtrack for this movie, we have Benjamin Wallfish creating the score. When they announced that he was going to be scoring this movie, I did start wondering how much they were going to kind of lean into the more sort of horror elements, considering Andy Muschietti directed It Chapter 1 and It Chapter 2, as I said a bit earlier. But Benjamin Wallfish did create the soundtracks for both of those movies as well, so I was kind of curious if they wanted this movie to kind of feel a bit like those films. It isn't, but I did feel like that was where they were going to go. But in all honesty, the soundtrack for this movie is really good. I was a little bit worried that they were going to go a little bit more like a techno sort of sound and just try and make it sound as sci-fi as possible, but like this is a really proper orchestral soundtrack, the kind that you'd normally have in a superhero movie. And seeing as though we do have a few returning characters in this movie, a few of those older themes do get reprisals in this soundtrack, and I like how they are used and utilised within this soundtrack. I will admit it is a little bit disappointing that Ben Affleck's Batman theme isn't included in this, because considering all the other characters do get a theme, I think that it could have included it somewhere. But outside of that, I really did like what they have done with this soundtrack. The music is really good. I think the main theme, especially the theme of the Flash just when he travels back in time, that is an absolutely beautiful theme. Probably my favourite bit of soundtrack in the movie, to be honest. But it is really good overall. I do think that it really does suit this movie and it does add a little bit more to it. The songs, on the other hand, are a bit of a mixed bag for me. I'll admit the songs that they've actually chosen to be in this movie, I do like. I really like some of the decisions that they have made with regards to what songs they have used through some of these sequences, but they don't always feel very suitable for some of the scenes that they are used in. Like, as I said, the song that they used for the opening sequence where the Flash is travelling from Central City to Gotham, I love that, absolutely love that. But then you get a sequence during the final act of this movie which does have a song that is very similar to that first one, but considering the context, especially with regards to some of the characters and what it is that they are doing, I feel like it is a little bit out of place. So I do like the songs that they do use. I do feel like some of the more emotional moments are enhanced because of the ones that they do use, but I do think that some of them are a little bit misplaced. Overall, I think this is pretty good. It isn't anywhere near as bad as some people have made it out to be, but it isn't great either, and I definitely wouldn't say it was the best superhero film ever made. And I'm guessing the people saying that probably haven't ever seen The Dark Knight, Superman the movie, or even the Flashpoint Paradox animated film, which is still the best adaptation of this story. But at least this film handles the story much better than the CW TV series did. It is fun, it is entertaining, and has some great visuals, characters, callbacks, action, references, costumes and music, but there are definitely some missed opportunities within the story and some other elements that to me didn't quite work, such as the CGI, some of the humour and music, as well as the overall pacing. I wouldn't say it was messy as some have said, but it is rushed and there is a lot introduced very late on, to the point where I think that this film could have benefited from an extended runtime, and that might have also helped some of the character decisions feel a bit more natural. That being said, the story that it is telling I think is good, and the emotional arc that Barry Allen goes through does work, and I did like it overall. I would say this is worth seeing at least once, especially if you are a fan of this character or DC Comics in general, but I wouldn't say that this is an absolute must-watch movie. I know there is a lot of debate on whether you should support this movie or not, and what I have to say on that is don't feel pressured one way or another into seeing it or not. It is completely your choice. I think you will be missing out on some great stuff if you do decide not to see it, but it is completely understandable, whatever your reasons are, if that's what you choose. I enjoyed it overall, and with everything that's been said, my rating for The Flash is 7 out of 10. Well, I think that's pretty much everything I'm going to say for this spoiler-free video. I am going to save a few of my more spoiler-filled thoughts for a spoiler talk video, and that will be out very soon, so keep an eye out for that. But as always, if you're enjoying this content, please like, please subscribe, hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that is going on here. If you have seen The Flash, let me know what you think about it down in the comments. Just keep it spoiler free if you can. Plus, if you have any recommendations for any future Rewind reviews you would like me to do in the future, let me know down in the comments. I have been asked to look at some of the other DCEU movies in the past, and I am planning on getting around to them. I also want to give a very brief shout out to the person who did help me film the intro to this video. I really could not have done it without you. Thank you so much for helping. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See you guys.